Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Since I was here on sabbatical in 1986, I love visiting from time to time, meeting all friends that I developed since then. Some of them are sitting over there, and seeing the younger generation over here and over there. It's wonderful. Before we reach the future, let's start with the very, very, very present days. As a matter of fact, with last week. I don't know how many of you watched the event at the White House when President Obama met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. There was something very interesting there. Can you guess what I'm talking about?
Body language.
No, this time it was not something especially. They had a press conference before the meeting. They always have press conference after the meeting. This time it was before the meeting. And it was clearly why. They didn't want to get into polemics after the meetings. So before, everybody was fine, happy, joyful, positive, etc. Then, so it looked odd to me, and I tried to get some more information about the meeting. So I realized that the meeting was supposed to take 2 hours, and it lasted for 3 hours, which means that they spoke not on principles. You don't talk about principles for 3 hours. You talk about details. And the third thing is that nothing was published after the meeting about the substance of the meeting, which never happens to Israelis. Kissinger once said that in Israel, a secret is something that you'll know tomorrow. You don't know it today, but tomorrow you'll know it. Nothing whatsoever. Neither the American media nor the Israeli journalists, who always know what's going behind closed doors. By the way, this is one of the greatest achievements of Secretary of State Kerry, who said that there will be no leaks from the negotiations. And indeed, there were no leaks. And many of the details that have been discussed there for the last 7.5 months were not published. There are some rumors here and there, some positions of some people, but it's the first time that I remember negotiations between Israelis and Arabs that there are no leaks on the details of the position of every one of the participants in the negotiations. So we know that they spoke about Iran, naturally. We know that they spoke about Syria, naturally. We know that they spoke about Ukraine, that's obvious. But they spoke also about the negotiations. And we don't know what they said. What we do know is that following that meeting, Netanyahu came out and gave, for the first time, a press conference to the Israeli journalists. He didn't give a press conference since he was re-elected more than a year ago. It was the first time that he spoke. And he had a very positive, looking forward, peace-oriented, wonderful presentation. So much so that an Israeli astute writer said, "Did he join Peace Now?" And others who are more sophisticated said maybe Netanyahu is preparing the Israeli public opinion for the deal, because he spoke about the fruits of peace. He even said for the first time that some settlements will have to be evacuated. First time that he said that. So it was a really very pro-peace speech, which brought some people to think that maybe some positive outcome we will see in the near future. If we look at the timetable, there's another explanation to what happened last week. And the timetable is as follows. This week, on Friday, Secretary of State Kerry is going to meet with Abdallah. Next week, on Monday, Abu Mazen is coming to Washington and is going to meet with Obama. On March 29, 3 more Palestinian prisoners have to be freed from Israeli jails. And April 29 is the deadline, the end of the period, of the 9 months period that Kerry gave to himself to bring peace to the Middle East. So we are very near the deadline. And we have to understand the latest developments because of that close situation. The original idea was indeed to prepare a paper which will be signed jointly by the Israelis and the Palestinians, and which will lay the ground for the peace process. or even for peace, for the peace agreement. But after a short period of time, everybody realized that such a paper will not be signed. Therefore, as you all know, the idea was not to have such a paper, but to prepare a draft of a framework agreement, an outline for a final peace deal. So this is an American paper that the Israelis and the Palestinians will accept with reservations. I guess that the number of reservations will be much longer than the paper, but at least they will sign the paper. And the first question is are they going to sign it or not? If we look at the game that the two partners, the Israelis and the Palestinians, are playing now, we can see 4 points. Number one is brinkmanship. We're getting close to the end of April. And therefore, each one of the two sides is trying to get the best deal. Netanyahu, for example, speaks a lot about the fact that the Palestinians have to agree that Israel will have to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Something that he's talking about today more than ever. Abu Mazen, on the other side, is talking much more than ever about the strategy that the Palestinian Authority will take after April if they will fail, namely to start a diplomatic warfare against Israel, to bring the issue to the UN and other international institutions, etc. So there is a brinkmanship. That's clear. But beyond that, that's the second point, we see something else, and that is that both sides are working very hard with one aim, that if there is a failure, the other side will be blamed. So what they do is not so much to reach an agreement, but to be sure that the other side will be blamed once the negotiation fails. And I analyze Netanyahu's very positive pro-peace late speech in this regard. I even told my Israeli fellows that some of the settlements will be evacuated. What else do I have to show you, the American people, President Obama, Secretary of State Kerry, that I seriously want to pursue peace? And I have to admit that in this particular game, Netanyahu is doing much better than Abu Mazen. Abu Mazen, in the last few weeks, has moved to the more extreme positions, while Netanyahu showed more readiness to compromise. I don't understand why. Maybe I should advise Abu Mazen what to do, but I don't understand why he did that. So some of his pronouncements in the last 2 weeks were more difficult to the Israelis to swallow than previously. He even organized a declaration by the Arab League that they will not accept Israel as a Jewish state. Why does he have to do that? Arafat himself said, and it's on record, that Israel is a Jewish state. It's the state of the Jews. So if Arafat said it, why should he go to the Arab League and ask them to say no? I'm not sure it was clever from his point of view. If you play now, if the most important issue is not to be blamed for the failure of the negotiations. So the third point, there is an interest of both parties to pursue the negotiations for another year, not to stop it now. And it's very clear. For the Palestinian Authority, their raison d'etre is to negotiate peace with Israel. If they will stop it and they will be blamed, they will not get hundreds of millions of dollars from all over the world, particularly the Europeans, and the Palestinian Authority will collapse. So they have to find a way to pursue the negotiations, even if they don't trust the Israelis and they don't believe that the Israelis really want to achieve peace. For the Israelis, they have a similar interest to continue the negotiations because of two reasons. One is to show the United States that they are really willing to make peace and therefore not to be blamed by the Americans. So the Americans can help Israel in international institutions, UN, etc. The Americans can put Europe off Israel's back, because if Israel will be blamed, the Europeans will definitely increase their pressure on Israel with sanctions, etc. So there is a clear interest for Israel that the negotiations will continue. And for Kerry, naturally, who wants to be a failure? So he spent all the last year in these negotiations against all odds. He doesn't want them to fail. So if he will get another year, it will solve that problem. So there is a clearly built-in interest of three parties to negotiate. To reach an agreement, that's a different story. But to negotiate. Therefore, the peace process became such a rotten term in the Middle East. We don't want to hear about process anymore, either peace or not, but don't talk about process. But the peace process will continue. And we, academics, journalists, others, will have plenty of opportunities to talk about it for the next year. Probably even later than that. So this is how things stand today. Now, all that occurred in the background of the very dramatic developments in the region. Part of it started before 7 months ago, namely the turmoil in the Middle East, which seems to be even worse than it was a year ago, and seems that it will be even continue to worsen in the next year or two. We cannot see a stability in the Middle East in the near future. That item we can talk for 20 minutes, but I don't want to go into that. But I guess I don't have to. But it's clearly that we see really a breakdown of the state system in the Middle East. We see forces which were very minor getting more power. We see instability. We see a construction of a new order. So all that doesn't help the Israelis and the Palestinians to negotiate an agreement. And something else that we see is the serious weakening of the U.S. position, particularly with regard to the developments in Ukraine. And you cannot underestimate the impact of the last week on Israeli public opinion, and not only in Israel, by the way. But I'm concentrating on Israel. But the public opinion has changed dramatically vis-a-vis the United States. Obama was never popular in Israel. Very few people supported him when he ran for the first time and when he ran for the second time. The majority of the Israelis did not trust him. After his visit to Israel, he was able to improve his popularity. For 30% people moved from negative to positive attitudes. Last week, I think it went below zero. I wonder whether there are more than few people who still trust him. The entire perspective that he presents, his worldview, his understanding of international relations, his terminology, his policy, his concept of international relations, all that seems alien to the Israelis and to many others, including Egyptians and others. But I'm talking about the Israelis. Obama's desire to move United States towards the European pole, from pro-Mars to pro-Venus, is considered terrible by the Israelis. Obama's preference for diplomacy over the use of force looks ridiculous to most of the Israelis. Obama's concept that you should engage the enemy looks by the Israelis as naivete. And when you see what happened in the Middle East in the last 2 or 3 years, and what happened in Crimea in the last week, most Israelis see that as an evidence that Obama is a naive person who has wonderful ideas, wonderful concepts, but he doesn't understand international relations. He doesn't understand how the world is managed, and particularly not the area where Israel is located. So, in this framework, the suspicious of the Israelis towards any move towards the Palestinians is much even worse than it was before. How can we trust the American? Take one example: the Jordan River. Before the Jordan Valley, before the Arab Spring, The position of Israel was that Israeli forces should stay along the Jordan River to prevent military forces from moving from the east side of the Jordan River to the west side, to the West Bank, to attack Israel. Sounds reasonable if you are an Israeli strategist. Definitely you don't need sovereignty over there. With the change of the Arab Spring, the position of Israel has moved more to the right. And the position of Netanyahu was, we need an Israeli, not just a presence there, it should be part of Israel. So the conditions have changed. And it took many, many hours for the American team to discuss it. Some ideas began to develop, and some of them these ones were leaked, that there will be an international force, including Americans, that will stay on the Jordan River. After what happened last week, Netanyahu will not accept it. Maybe 2 months ago he would have done it, but not after last week. If you are committed to the territorial integration of Ukraine and you let Putin do whatever he wants to do, why should we trust you that you will keep our interest in the Jordan River? And one can bring more examples to strengthen this particular point. I didn't plan to bring a PowerPoint with me, but I wanted to show. Had I brought a PowerPoint, I would have shown some of the pictures and that were published, caricatures that were published in Israeli newspapers in the last several days. One of them was really outstanding, but it's not only politically correct, it's not polite to show it, so I'm not going to show it to you. But the picture shows that President Obama is watching through his binocular, and he sees the Putin doing a terrible, ugly move with his hand. I don't want to show it to you, but I guess you understand what I mean. That really represents the position of the Israelis towards the United States and particularly towards Obama, and therefore they will not be willing to compromise on issues that a month ago Netanyahu was willing to compromise. So what's going to happen in the future? 5 scenarios. The first one is that the United States will enforce a settlement on both sides. That a paper will be prepared by the United States, will be put on the table for the two sides, not take it or leave it, but take it. That's an option. People spoke about that option more rigorously some months ago. I don't think that today the United States can do it, particularly with the change of the position of the United States in the region. And I don't think that President Obama would do it. So I would rule out that option, theoretical option. Another option is to have another sort of imposing settlements on the sides by calling for a peace conference, or putting a proposal on the Security Council table and to discuss it. That was also an option that was discussed in the last year or two. And again, this one as well, I won't give it high probability today because of the latest development. For that, you need the cooperation between the United States and Russia, and what sort of cooperation you have in the last few days. So it won't happen. So we are moving to the third scenario, which is interim agreements. Very many Israelis supported that idea. Not only doves, but also hawks. They said we have to do something. We cannot continue with the status quo, because no move brings wars in the Middle East. And don't forget that we had wars every decade since the 20s. So if we are not going to have some interim agreement, there will be another war. Who wants another war? But the Palestinians are very much against an interim agreement, and from their point of view, it can be understood. They're worried that any interim agreement will be the final agreement from the Israeli point of view. So if Israel will evacuate some of the territories and move more territories from region A to B and from B to C, and will leave some major topics like the refugees and Jerusalem for the final agreement, but will try and solve some of the easier problems. That will be the end of it. Or if the fence or the wall will be the future border, they will not accept it, and therefore I don't think that even an interim agreement will be highly probable, though it has much better chance than the other two that I mentioned. So today you hear more and more Israelis, and again both left and right, talking about unilateralism, a move taken by Israel. Israel unilaterally declared that we are moving back from major part of the territories, mainly from the territories on the east side of the fence, but we'll leave the major Israeli settlements, the big major concentration of settlements on the other side, and we'll continue to talk about other things later on. Maybe this will ease down the pressure on Israel. Unilateralism is not a very good solution, and we saw that from Sharon's act in Gaza. He thought that by doing that, he will be able to achieve, he didn't say peace, he used the word quiet, meant no hostilities with the citizens of Gaza. And he was wrong. Unilateralism will not do that. But there's only one positive element to discuss unilateralism, and that is the fact that most Israelis are still willing to withdraw from the majority of the West Bank, even with no peace. That's very positive, because in the past, most Israelis didn't want to withdraw from the West Bank at all. Then they were willing to withdraw from the West Bank only for peace. Now they are willing to withdraw even when there is no peace. So it shows that the public opinion is ready for a compromise. Unfortunately, the same 65-70% of the Israelis who are willing to withdraw from the West Bank do not believe that there is a partner to negotiate with, which you might say, I might say, it's a mistake, but this is what most Israelis believe. So this is unilateralism. I'll give it a little more percentage than interim agreement. And we reach the fifth scenario, and that is the continuation of the status quo. More of the same. Now, this is something that Americans cannot perceive, because two wonderful traits of American culture is A, to believe that every problem has a solution, and B, to be optimist. In the Middle East, we are neither optimists, nor do we believe that every problem has a solution. So the status quo, which sound more of the same, sounds terrible here, sounds very reasonable to the people who live in the Holy Land. So much so that the Israeli military has developed now a new concept in the last 2 years. I don't know what's the English term for it. I guess it will be called the battle between battles, or the war between wars. The concept in the past, the concept was that we once a decade we have a war, and then we have a period of no peace and no war, and then another war, and then another piece of tranquility. Now there isn't such a thing. Now we have a war, and a battle between wars, and then another war. Now the battle between wars is the things that you don't hear so much about it because they are under the radar. Do you know, for example, that every day there are 200,000 cyber attacks on Israel? Every day, 200,000 cyber attacks. On the other side, do you know that 50% of the operations of the Israeli Navy, you heard about one of them 2 days ago, 50% of the operations, which are about 200 a month, are done in enemy's waters in the last 2 years. There is a war going on, but it's under the radar. You hear the Israelis hit convoy in Sudan. You hear things happen in Iran, and other things happen in Israel. There is, under the radar, there is a war, but it's not an all-out war. It's not a war with many casualties. It's not a war that is screened on television screen or monitored by journalists. But there's a war. So the term that the Israeli military invented is the battle between battles, or the battles between war, or war between war. I don't know how to translate it in English. And that could continue for a long time. There will be negotiations. There will be outbursts of dramatic wars, and then for a long time, that sort of new war. So the concept of endless war maybe will be seen in the Middle East more than any other place. If that is the case, and I would, if I have to bet, I give that option of the more of the same the highest probability. If that is the case, the question is what impact it will have on the Middle East and on Israel. And again, as I'm concentrating on Israel, I will talk about that. And here the positions are really divided, like any other thing in Israel. There are two schools of thought. The one school of thought, which you are more familiar, because I guess that many of you read Haaretz, is the school of thought of the progressive Israelis, that I hope I belong to them, that see the very negative impact of the endless war on Israeli society. We see the more settlements. We see more extremism. We see strengthening of the nationalist approach. We see a political religiosity in the very negative sense of the word. We see decline in the level of democracy. Israel still is 25 or 26 out of 180 or 90 states on the Freedom House index. So we'll go down from 25, 26 to 30, 40, 45. We see a negative impact on Israeli society, lack of tolerance to others, not only Arabs but also to the foreign workers in Israel, etc. And what definitely will happen is, if the more of the same option will be the realistic one, the probability of reaching a two-state solution within 4, 5, 6 years will be over. Some people say there are two options. Either there will be, if there is not going to be a two-state solution, there will be it's a wonderful idea, because there will be only one state, and then the Palestinians and the Arabs will demand to be fully integrated. So it will be a democracy for Jews and Arabs. Forget about that. The Israelis are not confronting an opportunity whether to choose a Jewish state or a democratic state. They will choose a Jewish state. And if the number of the Palestinians will increase, they will find ways to decrease it. I'm not using the word ethnic cleansing, because there is not going to be ethnic cleansing, but Palestinians will be encouraged to live. And I saw an article a week ago by an Israeli right-wing thinker. He said, we don't have to push hard. They are living. Every year there are 10,000 Palestinians who leave the West Bank. So they will live. If they know that there is no solution, there will be no majority of Palestinians in the area. So the Israelis will prefer a Jewish state rather than a democratic state, and they will continue the way the things are done have been done in the last 7 years. On the other hand, the other school of thought said, "What are you talking about? You haaretz. You see only negative things that happen in Israel. Look at wonderful society; it's flourishing. Our economic situation has improved dramatically in the last 10 years, dramatically compared to the rest of the world. Israel has, as someone who was born in Israel, I'm fifth generation. It's in my blood to save water, and to pay double the price that you pay for petrol. Israel has enough water Israel will be able to give water to its neighbors, and Israel is going to export petrol, not petrol, but gas. So Israel is going to be independent in energy and water. Even Herzl didn't think that would happen. It's a new world. And there is society is strengthening, the economy is booming. There's also a cultural booming in Israel. The number of books that are published is per capita is the highest in the world. I'm not talking only about a Life Night in Tel Aviv. I'm talking about the Oscar ceremonies. In the last 4 years, every year there were Israeli films in the Oscar. They didn't get to the top, but they were second or third, particularly the documentaries from Israel. So if you visit the state, it looks as if it's heaven. There's a problem with the Arabs and the Palestinians, yes, but we are used to it. We had it for the last 100 years. We live in the jungle. We have to get used to the fact that we live in the jungle. We're not going to be weaker. On the contrary, we're stronger than ever, militarily, economically. And because of the developments in the Middle East and because of the new face of Russia, Americans are not going to push us to the corner. We are the best ally in the Middle East. We are the most stable state in the Middle East. So what are you talking about? You defeatists. So this is the school of thought which the majority of the Israeli believe. And if you tell them otherwise, they will brush you off. It's very difficult to conduct conversation today in Israel. There's a polarization in two sides, on both camps, and the majority of the Israelis support the hawkish position, not because they are not for peace, or not because they do not want to give back territories or to dismantle most of the settlements, but because they were educated or socialized to believe that there is no partner, and they buy it. Netanyahu is an excellent salesman. And unfortunately, the Palestinian leadership helped him from time to time, in the same way that they helped him, for example, last week. I'll finish with that. Had Abu Mazen said last week, all right, I don't understand why you need this declaration that you are a Jewish state. You didn't ask the Egyptians for such a declaration when you signed peace treaty with them. You didn't ask King Hussein for such a declaration when you signed peace treaty with them. You ask only from us. All right, you want to be a Jewish state? Be a Jewish state. It doesn't mean that we not continue to ask for the right of return. But you want to describe yourself as a Jewish state or state of the Jews, do it. It's your business, not ours. By saying that, he would pull the rug beneath Netanyahu. But if he stands so firmly behind his position that we cannot accept Israel as a Jewish state, it's a major mistake. It makes Netanyahu task to show that Palestinians are not willing to reach an overall agreement, a final solution, very easy. Because for him and for the Israelis, the recognition of the Palestinians that Israel is a Jewish state, by the way, a term that I hate, a state cannot be Jewish. People can be Jewish. A state, the sky, the land, the stones, the streets, the cars, they cannot be Jewish. But Israel can be recognized as the state of the Jews and all its citizens. That's fine. And Palestine will be recognized as the state of the Palestinians or Palestinian nation and all its citizens. And we solve the problem. I mean, that's so obvious, so simple. Because to argue that if Israel is considered a Jewish state, it means that the Palestinians do not have the right of return? Not at all. They can continue to claim the right of return. And the right of return will be discussed in practical terms between Israel and the Palestinians and will be solved. And there were always several solutions to that. The Geneva Accord reached an agreement on that. And the other way, Olmert, Abu Mazen negotiations agreed on that. It can be solved. Why do you have to stick with a theoretical definition of Israel as a state of the Jews or a state of the Jewish people or a Jewish state, and to say if we do that, it means that we are giving up our demand for the Palestinian refugees. So what I want to illustrate here is that, unfortunately, Netanyahu's life to tell the Israelis that there is no partner is easier than it should be. And if this is the condition, there is no clear leader of the Israeli progressive camp, what can you do? And therefore, the majority of the Israelis, though they support the peace initiative, they support peace agreement, they support the evacuation of the territories, they support evacuation of settlements, do not believe that there will be peace in our time. And some people say our time means a generation, maybe even 2 generations. Therefore, the status quo scenario seems to be most likely. How it will influence Israeli society, I read Haaretz. Thank you.
Thank you very much.